When Princess Anne appeared at the palace gates flanked by aides, her solemn expression sent shivers through the crowd. A single sentence from her lips would silence the nation and set the monarchy ablaze. The air outside Buckingham Palace that morning was thick with apprehension. Journalists had been summoned on short notice, their phones buzzing with an urgent message. Prepare for a statement from Her Royal Highness Princess Anne at 11 o'clock sharp. None knew what to expect. Such impromptu appearances were rare. And the very sight of Annie often, the stoic backbone of the family looking ashen yet resolute, was enough to stop conversation mid-sentence. There was no sign of King Charles, nor of Prince William or Queen Camilla. This glaring absence was not lost on the press. Photographers scanned the windows, searching for shadows of those who should have been there but weren't. It only heightened the sense that something monumental was about to happen. Anne stood silently at the podium for a moment, hands clasped tightly, her gaze fixed just beyond the cameras, as though she were bracing herself against some unseen force. For the first time in years, the crowd could see the faint shimmer of tears in her eyes, a quiet betrayal of her normally unshakable composure. The whispers began immediately. Some muttered about Charles's health. Others wondered if a scandal had erupted behind the gilded walls, finally forcing the family into the light. But no one, not the press, not even the palace staff who hovered just behind her, could have predicted the words that came next. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. "The crown," she began, her tone deliberate, heavy, deliberate, "will change sooner than you think." A collective gasp rose from the assembled reporters, who scrambled to parse her meaning as she continued. Anne's eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of defiance breaking through her grief. "It is her time," she added, leaving the rest hanging in the stunned silence that followed. That was all. No names, no dates, no explanations. Just those cryptic words, delivered with a kind of quiet authority that chilled everyone present. And in that moment, the cameras swung toward the palace doors, where staff could be seen wiping their eyes, whispering amongst themselves. The crowd erupted into questions. Does this mean King Charles is abdicating? Is Catherine already queen? Where is Camilla? But Anne ignored them all, stepping back from the microphones with an expression that dared anyone to stop her. The nation was left grasping at the pieces of her pronouncement, piecing together a narrative none had been prepared to hear. But as Anne stepped back from the microphones, what followed inside the palace would prove even more shocking than her words outside. Hours before Anne's public declaration, an explosive showdown erupted in the Queen's private drawing room that would decide the monarchy's future in a single blistering moment. The door had been shut firmly, the curtains drawn tight, and the air inside thick with tension. It was the kind of confrontation that had been building for months, yet no one expected it to finally ignite here. Now, in the very room where generations of monarchs had once plotted the fate of empires, Charles stood near the fireplace, his hands clenched behind his back, pacing in furious, deliberate strides. Each step echoed against the walls like a warning. Anne stood rigid by the window, her arms folded, eyes fixed on him with a mixture of exasperation and unspoken challenge. Catherine sat in one of the velvet chairs, eerily quiet, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed downward as though she already knew the outcome. William hovered just behind her, his face taut with restraint, but his shoulders squared as though ready to shield her from whatever might come next. And then there was Camilla, standing near the door, her expression shifting between outrage and disbelief. The silence finally broke when Charles turned on Anne, his voice low but cutting. "You can't force this," he hissed. But Anne's response came sharp and without hesitation. "We're not forcing anything. You're just refusing to see what's inevitable." Catherine remained silent, but her quiet presence spoke volumes. It was Camilla who finally snapped, her words slicing through the room like glass. "This is betrayal," she spat, her voice rising with every syllable. "After everything I've endured, this is how you repay me?" And before anyone could answer, she turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her so hard the portraits on the walls rattled. The room fell back into silence, but now it was charged, dangerous. Anne's voice softened, but her words carried more weight than ever. "Your health is failing, Charles," she said plainly, "and the public has turned. If you wait any longer, you'll take the crown and the entire family down with you." William finally stepped forward, his jaw set, his voice steady but brimming with conviction. "She's ready," he declared, his eyes meeting his father's with an intensity that startled even Anne. "More ready than any of us." Charles stopped pacing then. For a long moment he stood there, staring at nothing, his shoulders sagging as though the burden of 1,000 years had finally settled on him. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, he muttered the words that would seal their fate. "Then it's done." But even as those words hung heavy in the air, whispers of the chosen coronation date began leaking, and with them, a new storm. The date Anne revealed was no accident. It carried a chilling echo of history, and a quiet defiance that rattled royal traditionalists to their core. The nation was still catching its breath from the stunning confirmation of Catherine's ascendancy when Anne, standing once again before the cameras, dropped another revelation that sent shockwaves through the monarchy. Her voice was measured but laced with an almost cryptic gravity, as she uttered, "May 6, as it was written." Those 4 words immediately set tongues wagging, their meaning cloaked in mystery, yet undeniably deliberate. Journalists scrambled to uncover what lay behind the choice, but the palace offered no clarification. That silence, of course, only deepened the intrigue. It didn't take long for the connection to surface. Royal historians and keen-eyed observers pointed out that May 6 bore a dark stain in the family's annals, the anniversary of a long-buried scandal involving an abdication, whispers of betrayal, and a queen who had once turned her back on love to preserve the crown. To many, it seemed as though Anne was resurrecting that wound on purpose, daring the family and the world to confront the ghosts they had tried so hard to forget. But speculation quickly splintered into 2 camps. Some insisted the choice of May 6 was a direct rebuke to Camilla, a symbolic rejection of her controversial place in the monarchy's history. They noted how Catherine's allies in the press framed the date as restoring honor where it had once been stolen. Others, however, saw something more poignant, a veiled tribute to Diana. The whispers grew louder that Catherine herself had personally insisted on the date, believing it would transform a day of disgrace into a day of triumph. Even within the palace walls, the decision divided loyalties. Senior courtiers reportedly warned that such a date risked splitting the monarchy in 2, as older generations clung to tradition, while younger factions rallied behind Catherine's bold defiance. Commentators called it reckless yet brilliant, a gamble that could either heal the institution or tear it further apart. Anne, when pressed by reporters on whether she feared the backlash, only narrowed her eyes and replied with an icy calm, "It is her rightful moment and her own making, let them write what they will." The tone in her voice left little doubt that the choice was both deliberate and deeply personal, a signal that Catherine's reign would not be dictated by the ghosts of the past, but instead would confront them head-on. But while the public marveled at the date's eerie resonance, the reaction from Camilla and her faction would escalate the crisis into open warfare. Locked behind palace walls, Camilla waged a final, furious battle to stop Catherine's coronation, and in doing so, exposed secrets that left even loyalists stunned. It began in the aftermath of Anne's chilling declaration of the date, when the echoes of public approval still reverberated outside the gates. Camilla stormed into the private council chamber, her fury so palpable even the most seasoned courtiers shrank back. With a voice quivering between anger and desperation, she demanded Charles rescind the decision, calling it a travesty that would destroy everything we've fought to preserve. But Charles, weary and hollow-eyed, simply stared at her, offering no answer, as though her words no longer carried weight. Anne, however, had no such patience for silence. When Camilla's voice rose to a piercing accusation, Anne cut her off, her tone sharp enough to sting. The 2 women locked horns, their words escalating, nearly erupting into a full-blown shouting match that startled even the hardened aides outside the door. Camilla's face flushed with rage as she hurled accusation after accusation at Catherine, calling her a schemer, a manipulator, and worse, declaring that she had humiliated her publicly and turned Charles into a shell of himself. Her tirade didn't end there. In a fit of unbridled anger, she seized the royal documents from the table, proclamations, draft speeches, ceremonial orders, and tore them apart with trembling hands, leaving scraps strewn like confetti on the polished floor. Those present gasped at the sheer audacity, some retreating into the shadows, others frozen by the spectacle of a woman who had held so much power now unraveling before their eyes. Her allies beyond the palace were no less ferocious. Within hours, murmurs began swirling through the House of Lords as whispers of procedural challenges surfaced. Letters were sent, calls made, and behind-the-scenes machinations threatened to halt the coronation entirely. The corridors of Westminster buzzed with talk of a constitutional crisis, of petitions and motions designed to stall what now seemed unstoppable. But Anne remained unmoved. As Camilla's fury reached its zenith, She stood silent and still, her expression as cold and unyielding as stone. And when the shouting finally subsided into bitter sobs, Anne spoke just one sentence, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "It's done. Step aside, or be dragged aside." Those words left no room for argument, no path for retreat. Camilla froze, her fury turning to stunned silence as she realized the depth of her defeat. But as Camilla's desperate resistance collapsed, another unexpected player entered the fray and changed everything again. Even as his wife prepared to ascend the throne, William stunned advisors with a private decision, one that risked everything he stood to inherit. In the quiet hours after Camilla's defeat, when the palace should have been basking in its hard-won calm, William summoned a handful of his most trusted aides. What he revealed behind those closed doors struck them speechless. With a grave intensity, he confessed that he had considered abdicating alongside his father, walking away entirely rather than being complicit in what he feared might destroy the family from within. The words hung in the air like a confession too heavy to bear, and for a moment even he seemed unsure if he truly meant them. Torn between loyalty to the father who raised him and the woman he loved beyond reason, William found himself at a crossroads. Neither title nor lineage could guide him through. The weight of it showed in his voice as he admitted he felt he was betraying someone no matter which path he chose. Those closest to him described a man unraveling, caught between two impossible loyalties, and the crushing realization that his every choice would define not just his own future, but the crown itself. But it was a quiet, piercing conversation with Princess Anne that finally shattered the doubt clouding his judgment. She pulled him aside one evening and spoke to him, not as an heir, but as a man who loved fiercely and had suffered enough. Anne reminded him of the strength Catherine had shown, the storms she had endured without flinching, and the unspoken truth that Charles himself had quietly acknowledged, that the monarchy would not survive another decade without her. That conversation broke through William's hesitation like sunlight through storm clouds. By the following morning, he emerged resolute. He insisted on making his own speech to the nation, standing beside Anne, not as a passive heir, but as an active protector of Catherine's destiny. When he told Charles of his decision, the old king reportedly lowered his head, his voice cracking as he murmured, "You are your mother's son." It was the only blessing William needed. Later that day, he vowed aloud in words that would echo through the palace halls that he would stand by Catherine even if it means defying the crown itself. His aides described the vow not as defiance but as quiet rebellion, the kind that comes not from anger but from love strong enough to withstand the sharpest daggers of duty. But just as the royal family appeared united behind Catherine, a final twist threatened to unravel the entire plan before it even began. Days before Catherine's coronation, an explosive set of letters surfaced revealing Queen Elizabeth's hidden wishes and a shocking final command. It began with a leak that no one saw coming. An anonymous envelope arrived at several major newsrooms in London, each containing copies of handwritten letters allegedly penned by the late Queen Elizabeth herself. What lay within those fragile pages would shake the very foundations of the monarchy, igniting a media firestorm and forcing the palace into a desperate scramble. The letters, dated during the final months of her reign, explicitly named Catherine as her chosen successor should Charles falter, a phrase that was repeated more than once and underlined with a decisive flourish. But the revelation did not end there. Included with the letters was a shocking codicil, a secret amendment to her will bypassing Camilla entirely. The codicil stated that in the event of Charles's abdication or incapacity, the crown would pass directly to Catherine, not to Camilla or any other claimant. The words were unambiguous, her signature unmistakable. Speculation erupted immediately over who had orchestrated this earth-shattering leak. Some pointed to Anne, whose icy resolve and loyalty to her mother's vision made her the obvious candidate. Others whispered that William himself, determined to shield his wife from further humiliation, may have sanctioned it. Neither spoke publicly, leaving the truth to fester in the shadows. The palace, caught off guard, scrambled to verify the document's authenticity. For nearly 2 days, silence reigned behind the gates, as forensic experts and senior advisors pored over the handwriting, the seals, and the legal language. But the public needed no convincing. Overnight, support for Catherine surged, as crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, waving banners that read, "Her Majesty's Choice." Even Camilla's allies, who only days earlier had threatened procedural challenges and rallied behind her, began to fall silent. their arguments crumbled under the weight of the Queen's unmistakable words, leaving them exposed and without a cause. One by one, statements of support for Catherine poured in, not just from the press, but from influential figures across the Commonwealth, painting her ascension not as a coup, but as the fulfillment of a long-hidden royal wish. The leak didn't just weaken Camilla's position, it obliterated it. Suddenly, her protest seemed petty, her fury misdirected. Those who had once murmured doubts about Catherine now hailed her as the rightful heir to the throne. And as the letters spread like wildfire through the nation, the air around the coronation shifted from scandal to inevitability, from suspicion to destiny. With the Queen's wishes now out in the open, nothing could stop what came next the day the crown would finally pass. On the eve of her coronation, Catherine faced her own quiet reckoning, a solitary walk through palace corridors where ghosts of the Queen's past seemed to whisper their verdicts. The palace had never felt so heavy, its silence thick with expectation and the weight of centuries pressing down on her. After weeks of fiery battles and public spectacle, Catherine retreated into herself, seeking out the sanctuary where her resolve could either harden or shatter. For hours, she was seen alone in the Queen's private chapel, sitting motionless on the cold stone bench where Elizabeth herself had once knelt to pray. Aides reported hearing no sound, but the faint murmur of her breath as she clutched something tightly in her hands, a delicate locket containing a photo of Diana, her face smiling faintly from within the frame, as though to remind Catherine of the cost of this path. Later that night, palace staff noticed her scribbling furiously at her writing desk. It wasn't official correspondence or ceremonial notes, but a letter to her children, folded neatly and tucked away with a simple inscription, "Just in case." The act was both maternal and defiant, a testament to the quiet fear she carried behind her outward grace. William entered briefly around midnight, his face drawn with concern. But when he gently asked if she wanted company, she shook her head and smiled faintly, asking instead for solitude before dawn. There was a look in her eyes he couldn't argue with, not sadness, not joy, but something more powerful, a determination that demanded to be met on its own terms. Only Anne lingered longer. Just before the clock struck 2, she appeared in the doorway, silent at first, watching Catherine from across the room. Then she crossed the floor, placed a firm hand on her shoulder, and leaned in to whisper what no one else dared say aloud, "You've earned every stone in that crown." Those words hung in the air long after Anne left, a final benediction that seemed to settle the turmoil in Catherine's chest. Beyond the palace walls, the world was not sleeping. Thousands had gathered outside in the dark, candles flickering against the night sky, as chants of her name rose like a tide. They waited with quiet reverence, some pressing handwritten notes against the gates, others simply standing in silence, as though participating in a vigil for a monarch not yet crowned but already theirs. Inside, Catherine rose from her chair, straightened her shoulders, and let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. And as the first light of morning broke over London, Catherine emerged, and the world would never see the monarchy the same way again. When Catherine finally stepped onto the balcony crowned as queen, the crowd erupted, but beneath the cheers lay a silent war still far from over. The square outside Buckingham Palace had grown into a sea of faces, a living testament to history unfolding. As the doors opened, all eyes turned upward, and Catherine emerged draped in a gown that echoed Elizabeth's regal simplicity, yet carried her own quiet defiance. But it was the choice of crown that struck like lightning Diana's tiara, glinting defiantly atop her head, a symbol that sent the square into a frenzy of applause and left courtiers whispering with both awe and apprehension. The cheers roared so loudly that they rattled the ancient stones beneath her feet, shaking the square in a way no coronation had in living memory. In that moment, the crowd's energy became almost unbearable, a tidal wave of expectation crashing into her, and yet she stood resolute. At the edge of the window, nearly hidden by the drapery, Charles watched silently, his expression unreadable as the air thickened with the weight of what he had given up, and to whom. Beside her stood William, his hand subtly resting behind her back, as though anchoring her in place, his eyes glassy but unyielding, carrying pride and pain in equal measure. He knew better than anyone what she had endured to reach this day, and his presence at her side spoke louder than words. Yet it was the absence that unsettled the atmosphere more than any presence could. Camilla was nowhere to be seen. Not in the procession, not in the window, not even in the gallery where her supporters sat stiff-backed and uneasy. Her whereabouts remained a mystery, that simmered quietly beneath the thunder of the crowd. A question nobody dared to ask aloud, yet everyone wondered. Anne flanked Catherine during the ceremonial procession, her steps measured and unwavering, her face set like stone as she shadowed the new queen, in what many would later call the most public declaration of loyalty in modern royal history. For every whisper of betrayal, there was Anne, standing as a reminder that Catherine had earned this not just through heritage, but through battle. And when the noise finally softened, Catherine stepped forward, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces below, and spoke the words that would etch themselves into history. "This is not the end, but our beginning." The crowd erupted once more, but even in their joy, there lingered an undeniable tension, a shadow beneath the celebration. Yet even as the crown settled on her head, unseen forces were already plotting what they hoped would be her downfall. In the days after Catherine's coronation, whispers of revenge, secret meetings, and quiet betrayals began to ripple through the palace, proving the fight for the crown was far from over. Barely a week had passed before troubling reports surfaced. Camilla, who had vanished from sight during the coronation, was now said to be hosting clandestine gatherings at private estates across the countryside. Senior peers, long loyal to the old order, were seen slipping into these meetings under the cover of night. Even foreign dignitaries, some with histories of exploiting royal scandal for their own ends, were reportedly in attendance. To those watching closely, it was clear Camilla was not finished. She was simply changing her tactics. Meanwhile, Charles retreated to Balmoral, citing exhaustion and poor health, though few believed that was the whole story. Those close to him claimed he had become unreachable, refusing calls from even his most trusted advisors. Some said he spent his days pacing through the misty grounds, others that he had taken to bed entirely, whispering regrets no one could quite understand. Whatever the truth, his silence created a dangerous vacuum, one Camilla seemed eager to fill. Then came the letters. Unmarked, unsigned, but unmistakable in their intent, they arrived at Catherine's security offices in the dead of night. Threats cloaked in polite language but dripping with menace. Promises that her reign would be short-lived, that the crown she wore was nothing more than stolen gold waiting to be torn away. The palace tightened its defenses at once. William ordered sweeping reviews of security for himself, Catherine, and the children, stationing guards at every entrance, demanding coded checks and heightened surveillance. His determination was as fierce as it was quiet, an unspoken promise that no harm would come to her, not while he still drew breath. But even within the walls, unease grew. Anne, who had stood so firmly at Catherine's side through every battle, gathered the palace staff one evening and delivered a warning so sharp it cut through the quiet like a knife. "This family eats its own when cornered," she said flatly. "And we are all very much cornered." The words hung in the air long after she left, a stark reminder that the crown had not ended the war, it had merely drawn new battle lines, and as days stretched into weeks, it became impossible to ignore the chill beneath the celebration, the uneasy truth that what had been won in public was still being fought in private. The monarchy, for all its pomp and power, now stood on a knife's edge balanced between triumph and ruin. And so, as Catherine's reign begins under a storm of triumph and treachery, the nation holds its breath, knowing the next revelation could topple everything once again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.